What if I told you that a single Ottoman decision could have prevented the Gallipoli tragedy and saved 130,000 lives? The Ottoman Empire's entry into World War I alongside Germany changed everything, but history wasn't inevitable. In this alternate timeline, we'll explore what would have happened if the Ottomans had simply done nothing. The Ottoman crossroads, decisions that changed the war. What if the most consequential decision of World War I wasn't made in Berlin, London, or Paris, but in Constantinople? The year 1914 found the Ottoman Empire at a crossroads that would ultimately shape the course of history. Often called the sick man of Europe, the empire was reeling from a century of decline, political instability, and crushing military defeats. The First and Second Balkan Wars had just drained their treasury and military resources, leaving them desperate and vulnerable at precisely the moment when Europe was about to ignite. The once mighty Ottoman Empire stood at a precipice, with territory spanning 3 continents but lacking the strength to defend it all. The great powers circled like vultures, each eyeing strategic pieces of Ottoman territory should the empire finally collapse. Inside the halls of power, a fierce ideological battle unfolded. A high-stakes chess match where each move risked the empire's future. While some leaders envisioned revival through alliances, others saw neutrality as the only path to survival. 3 distinct factions emerged, each pulling the empire in different directions. The pro-German camp, championed by War Minister Enver Pasha, saw alliance with Germany as the path to restoring Ottoman greatness. Having served as a military attaché in Berlin, Enver had developed deep personal connections with German military leadership and genuinely believed in German military superiority. Meanwhile, the pro-British majority in the Ottoman cabinet viewed Britain as the traditional protector of Ottoman territorial integrity. A third faction advocated strict neutrality, arguing that the empire simply couldn't survive another major conflict. Grand Vizier Said Halim Pasha represented this moderate voice, desperately trying to keep his nation out of the European bloodbath about to unfold. The diplomatic struggle for Ottoman allegiance intensified daily. German diplomats offered tempting proposals, an anti-Russian alliance and the promise of territorial expansions in the Caucasus and beyond. The British response remained ineffective, hampered by their ambassador's absence during these critical weeks, leaving Ottoman pro-British officials without crucial diplomatic support. Then came the pivotal event that tipped the scales towards Germany. When war broke out, 2 German warships, the battle cruisers Goeben and light cruiser Breslau, were caught in the Mediterranean, pursued by the British fleet. After escaping to Messina in neutral Italy, Admiral Souchon made the fateful decision to head for Constantinople, despite Ottoman neutrality. Tension gripped Ottoman leadership as the ships arrived. International law demanded they either turn the ships away or impound them. Instead, they executed a calculated political maneuver, allowing passage through the Dardanelles. To maintain an appearance of neutrality, they announced a purchase of the ships while keeping the German crews aboard in Turkish uniforms, a transparent fiction that fooled no one. These ships became the physical embodiment of German influence anchored in Ottoman waters and represented a tremendous increase in Ottoman naval power, especially significant after Britain had infuriated the Ottomans by seizing 2 battleships they had already paid for. Had moderate voices prevailed with genuine neutrality, the consequences would have been dramatic. The Dardanelles Strait would have remained open for international shipping, allowing Russia to maintain crucial supply lines with Western allies. Ottoman territories would have been spared from becoming battlegrounds, saving millions of civilians. A neutral Ottoman Empire would have redrawn the strategic map of the war. Germany would have lost a critical ally that stretched British and Russian resources thin. The Gallipoli campaign, claiming over 250,000 lives, would never have happened. Those Allied forces could have deployed to the deadlocked Western Front instead. For Russia, Ottoman neutrality would have provided a vital lifeline through the Turkish Straits, allowing continued grain exports and military imports. Russia might have avoided the economic collapse contributing to the 1917 revolution. Germany, without Ottoman forces tying down allies in the Middle East and Caucasus, would have faced greater pressure on both the Eastern Front and in the Balkans, potentially ending the war sooner with fundamentally different terms. Russia's lifeline: how Ottoman neutrality reshapes the Eastern Front. While Germany would have suffered from Ottoman neutrality, Russia stood to gain something far more valuable than military advantage: its very survival. The simple decision made in Constantinople on September 28, 1914, to close the Turkish Straits to international shipping might have been the single most devastating blow to Russia's war effort that didn't involve a direct military defeat. This was a stranglehold on an empire's lifeline. When the Ottoman Empire aligned with Germany, sealing off the Dardanelles effectively cut off 90% of Russia's import and export capacity in a single stroke. Picture a nation fighting history's most demanding war while suddenly unable to sell what it produces or buy what it needs. Like a dam holding back vital resources, the closed straits trapped Russia behind economic walls while the war raged on. In villages across Russia, farmers watched helplessly as grain piled up with nowhere to go. Without Black Sea exports, prices collapsed. "What good is a record harvest if it rots in storehouses?" a farmer near Odessa might have lamented as his family faced ruin despite their abundant crop. Meanwhile, in the trenches of the Eastern Front, a young soldier named Mikhail might have huddled with his comrades, scanning the horizon for German troops while lacking even a basic rifle. "Wait until someone falls," his commander would instruct grimly. "Then, take his weapon." The blockade created a devastating timeline of collapse. First, economic paralysis, then military weakness, followed by civilian hardship, and finally, revolutionary conditions. Russian factories halted production without imported materials, while the government's war coffers emptied without export revenues. This economic machinery, necessary for sustaining a modern war effort, ground to a halt under the pressure of isolation. By 1916, the cracks were visible everywhere. In Petrograd's bread lines, a mother might stand for hours in the bitter cold, only to find supplies exhausted. "My children haven't eaten in 2 days," she would tell neighbors who could offer no help, facing the same desperate situation themselves. The closed straits had become a tightening noose around Russia's future. Had the Dardanelles remained open in our alternate scenario, Russia's connection to its Western allies would have sustained both its military and civilian populations. British and French munitions would have reached Russian soldiers, while Russian grain would have fed international markets, maintaining economic stability. This open economic artery would have pumped life-sustaining resources through the Russian Empire when it needed them the most. The military consequences of this alternative would have transformed the Eastern Front. Properly equipped Russian forces would have presented Germany with a formidable challenge, forcing them to divert precious resources from their Western Front operations. This strategic pressure would have reverberated across both battlefronts, potentially shortening the war by months or years. More significantly, the human suffering that fueled revolution might never have reached critical mass. Without extreme food shortages in cities and supply crises at the front, public confidence in the Tsarist government might have endured. The bread riots and military mutinies that sparked the February 1917 revolution might never have ignited, fundamentally altering the century's trajectory. Without the Russian Revolution, there would be no Treaty of Brest-Litovsk withdrawing Russia from the war. Germany would have remained pressured on both fronts, likely hastening their defeat. A shorter war means millions of lives saved, and different terms at Versailles. This historical crossroads reveals how Ottoman neutrality might have preserved Russia's connections to global markets, potentially preventing a revolution that reshaped world politics for generations. The Cold War as we know it might never have existed, all because a strategic waterway remained open for commerce instead of closed for war. Redrawing the map, the Middle East that never was. Beyond preventing a Russian collapse, Ottoman neutrality might have rewritten the map in ways we can barely comprehend. When Western powers carved up the Ottoman territories after the war, they created borders with a ruler and pencil that still define and divide the Middle East today. These weren't natural boundaries that evolved over centuries, they were hasty compromises made in European drawing rooms by men who had promised the same lands to multiple parties. And the most remarkable part? This entire reshaping of world geography happened because one empire chose the wrong side in a European conflict. The moment the Ottoman Empire entered World War I, British and French diplomats seized their opportunity. Here was the perfect justification to finally dismantle the sick man of Europe and divide its valuable territories between themselves. The infamous Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916 carved up the Middle East like a wedding cake at a diplomatic reception. France would control Syria and Lebanon, while Britain would get Palestine, Jordan, and Iraq. This agreement directly contradicted other promises made simultaneously. The British, desperate for allies against the Ottomans, had encouraged the Arab Revolt of 1916 by promising independence to the same territories they had already divided with France. These diplomatic deceptions created borders as fragile as chalk lines on the pavement, artificial boundaries that ignored centuries of complex ethnic, religious, and tribal relationships. Consider the border between Iraq and Kuwait, drawn as a straight line through desert sand by British officials. This arbitrary boundary later fueled Saddam Hussein's 1990 invasion, when he claimed Kuwait was an artificial entity carved out from Iraq's historical territory. The border had no relation to tribal lands, watersheds, or historical boundaries. It existed purely because European diplomats decided it should. After the war, the newly created League of Nations established the Mandate system, legitimizing European colonial control over former Ottoman territories. These artificial borders cut through tribal lands, divided ethnic groups, and forced historically hostile communities to live under the same flags. Many of today's most persistent conflicts in the Middle East, from the Israeli-Palestinian dispute to sectarian tensions in Iraq and Syria, trace their origins directly to these post-war agreements. But what if the Ottoman Empire had chosen neutrality? Without Ottoman participation in the war, the entire justification for this territorial carve-up would have vanished. The empire would have remained intact, at least temporarily, and these arbitrary borders would never have materialized. A neutral Ottoman Empire might have followed a dramatically different path. Before the war, the Young Turk movement had already initiated reforms aimed at modernizing the empire. Without the devastating losses of war, these reforms could have continued in a more stable environment. Rather than a sudden collapse, we might have seen a gradual evolution, perhaps toward a more federated structure accommodating the empire's diverse populations. This alternate path would have completely avoided the colonial mandate system that brought European domination to the region. Instead of ruler straight lines ignoring centuries of social development, political boundaries might have evolved organically. Communities that had coexisted for generations might have found their own path towards self-determination, rather than having it imposed from the outside. Without the arbitrary division of the region, would ISIS have emerged from the power vacuums of fractured states? Would the Kurdish people still be divided across 4 different countries? Would the sectarian violence in Iraq and Syria have taken the same forms? What we can say with certainty is that Ottoman neutrality would likely have led to the Middle East developing along its own trajectory, rather than one imposed by outside powers with colonial interests. The borders might have been messier on maps, but more sensible on the ground, following natural features, ethnic distributions, or historical trade routes rather than straight lines drawn through deserts by distant powers. Conclusion. As our exploration of this alternate timeline comes to a close, it's worth reflecting on how history often hangs by the thinnest of threads. Historian Kemal Karpat's insights prove crucial here. The Ottoman entry into war was a hasty decision by a handful of elitist leaders who lacked vision and fell victim to German manipulation. When we examine different Ottoman choices, we recognize that history isn't predetermined. Rather, it's a cascade of choices, momentous and minor alike, rippling across time unpredictably. Like dominoes carefully arranged, empires rise and fall on decisions that could have tipped differently with the slightest change of pressure or perspectives. Stay tuned.